Loved You Better Than You Knew by Mrs. McVeigh Miller. Copyright 1897, now in the public domain. Chapter 21. A Quarrel with Fate. Mrs. Flint would have been very lonely after her brother's departure, but for the fact that she had her hands and her mind both full with helping the nurse to care for the poor wayfarer so strangely thrown on her hands. As it was, her anxiety over Cinthia was soon dissipated by the receipt of a telegram from Mr. Don, announcing that he had found his daughter safe in Washington and that they would go on a trip to New York. Several days later, a short letter followed the telegram saying they had concluded to take a run over to Europe for an indefinite stay. He believed that change of scene was the best way to wean Cinthia from her infatuation for Arthur Varian. No mention was made of the legacy that had so opportunely fallen to Cinthia, but Mr. Don enclosed a liberal check to his sister and asked that she would use some of it in behalf of the woman he had brought home that night, stating that he had recognized in her a former servant of Cynthia's mother. Mrs. Flint began to take considerable more interest in the invalid when she learned this interesting fact. She had always cherished a lively curiosity over Cynthia's mother, and it had never been properly gratified, but the little knowledge she had made her thirsty for more. That she was beautiful, vain, and unprincipled, Everard Don had acknowledged, but he did not even possess a picture of her, although Mrs. Flint fancied he must have loved her well from the way he had exiled himself at her death. She was anxious for the sick woman's recovery, for she fancied the woman could tell her more of Everard's dead wife than her brother had ever chosen to divulge himself. So she was unremitting in her care, as were also Dr. Savoy and the trained nurse. But for several weeks the woman's life hung on a thread, and it was evident that exposure of that wintry night had been preceded by keen privation and almost starvation, making her hold on life so frail that she had almost let it go. It was far into December before she became convalescent enough to impart her name and some curt information about herself. "My name is Rachel Dane, and I came from Florida in search of work," she said, rather sullenly, adding, "I'm a capital sick nurse, but I could get no more work of that kind, and I thought I'd hire out for a lady's maid, or even a cook, for I can do anything I have a mind to turn my hand to." Old Dr. Savoy, to whom she was talking, smiled benevolently, and beaming on Mrs. Flint, remarked, "I don't think you'll have to fare any farther for a job as maid of all work when you get strong enough, for my old friend here certainly needs a good domestic, now that she isn't as young as she once was." Mrs. Flint had never thought of the subject in that way before, but when her old friend Dr. Savoy presented it so artfully to her mind, she consented to the plan, knowing that she would be very lonely in the quiet house, now that wilful Cynthia's bright presence was removed. So when the snows of Christmas lay deep on the ground, the new servant was up and about the little house, serving her new mistress skillfully and well, but preserving a rather sullen and taciturn demeanor, as if somehow she had a quarrel with fate and could not be reconciled to some scurvy trick it had played upon her now or in past days. While Mrs. Flint was wondering how to put to her some plain questions as to her service with her brother's wife, Rachel Dane forestalled her by saying, in a sort of casual way, "When I got off the train at the station, I saw a man I used to know, Mr. Everard Don. Does he live hereabout?" "No," replied Mrs. Flint. "Visiting, maybe?" with veiled anxiety. "Yes." "Oh, at whose house?" "At mine, but he has gone to Europe now," returned Mrs. Flint succinctly. The woman started and muttered some inaudible words as though she had received an unpleasant surprise. "Perhaps you don't know that it was Everard Don, my brother, who brought you in here out of the snow that night?" added Mrs. Flint. "So he saved my life," Rachel Dane muttered grimly. "And you say he is your brother, Mrs. Flint?" "Yes, and he told me he recognized you as a former servant. Is it true?" "Yes. I lived with Mrs. Don 2 years. It was when her eldest child was born, before they left the South and moved north. I suppose she has several children now, ma'am?" with eager inquiry. Mrs. Flint stared at her in surprise. "Then you haven't heard, you don't know, that Mrs. Dawn died when little Cinthia was 5 years old, and there never was another child?" "Dead! Mrs. Dawn dead!" the woman cried with sharp regret, while a spasm of pain passed over her face, and she sprung excitedly to her feet. "You must have been very fond of her," remarked Mrs. Flint curiously. "Fond of her? Oh, yes, naturally. I lived with her some time, you see, as maid of all work. Mr. Don wasn't rich then, but perhaps he's better off now," with keen interest. "No, and never will be, for it sort of took the heart out of him when Cynthia's mother died. He brought me the child to raise, and went off wandering over the world to drown his sorrow." Rachel Dane's glum face related in surprise, as she exclaimed, "Humph! I never thought he was so fond of her as that. All the love seemed to be on her side." "So she was fond of him?" "Fond ain't no word for it. She just worshipped the ground he walked on. Her sun rose and set in him. She was grateful for a smile or a kind word, and mighty few she got for all that. For all of the glum, moody men I ever saw, Mr. Don was the worst. I believe he hated his own life." "It was a guilty conscience, maybe," suggested Mrs. Flint, watching her out of the corner of her eye to see how much she knew. "You mean that he had treated his first wife bad for her sake? Yes, maybe it was remorse. I don't rightly know the facts, but I heard whispers," answered Rachel Dane, coolly, adding, "There was something strange about it. His indifference to his wife, even after the child was born, that she thought would bring them closer together. But la," bringing herself up with a jerk, "this is all guesswork on my part. Maybe he loved her in a reserved kind of way. Anyway, I'm mighty sorry she's dead. But where's the child?" "Cinthia. Her father came and took her away while you were sick. They have gone to Europe." "There! The kettle's boiling over!" exclaimed Rachel Dane, rushing to the stove, and after that she avoided the subject of the deceased Mrs. Dawn. But there could be no doubt that she was sincerely sorry over her death, for she became glummer and more taciturn from that hour, and her quarrel with fate grew more bitter. But she stayed on with the lonely widow, giving good service, and perhaps grateful for the comfortable home she enjoyed, while she certainly relieved the loneliness of the quiet home that echoed no more to the girlish footsteps of Cinthia. Mrs. Flint missed the girl more than she could have deemed possible. She had secret spasms of remorse over the rigid life she had led the poor girl, all on account of having had a poor opinion of her mother. "I was trying to bring her up right, so she might not follow in her mother's footsteps, but maybe I was too hard on her," she mused, "and if I had her back here, I'd try to act a little different to the poor girl. Still, I can't think that anything I did to her was half as bad as Everard's refusing to let her marry Arthur Varian. To the day of my death that'll be a mystery to me, why he refused such a good chance for Cinthia. A poor girl like her ain't never going to get such another offer, and they do say that since the Varians came back to Idlewild, that Arthur looks like a ghost. Mrs. Boughs says they have a house party for Christmas, with lots of awful pretty girls, but that he don't care for any of them, though his proud mother's trying her hardest to marry him off to one of them. Well, well, maybe his luck and Cynthia's may turn and they'll marry yet. I do hope so, for I love to see a girl marry her first love." There was one thing about her handmaid that did not altogether please the pious Mrs. Flint. She discovered that Rachel Dane was wholly irreligious. She neither attended church, read the Bible, nor said her prayers at night, 3 facts that quite shocked her employer. In kindly remonstrating with the woman, the widow found out that she cherished a grievance. Her quarrel with fate was poverty. "I will not worship a being who makes such a difference between his creatures, blessing some with riches and happiness and cursing others with poverty and woe," she said rebelliously. And all Mrs. Flint's pious arguments made no change in her mood. She only answered flatly, "I beg that you will not waste arguments on me, ma'am. I've heard all that before, and it don't alter my opinion at all." Mrs. Flint found out that the desire of the woman's heart was to have a snug little fortune of her own, and she would never have a good opinion of the Lord until her desire was gratified. One day, while she was looking out of the front window, she saw Arthur Varian going past in a sleigh with his mother, the silver bells ringing out gaily as they sped over the snow, while their rich fur robes and sealskin garments gave evidence of their wealth and position. "Who are those grand rich people?" she asked enviously. Mrs. Flint told her, and added with pardonable pride that the young man had been a suitor for Cynthia's hand, but her father had separated the lovers. "He was very foolish unless he had some good reason," exclaimed Rachel Dane. "He did not have any good reason that I could find out," returned Mrs. Flint, adding regretfully, "It would have been a splendid match for Cinthia. I have heard that Arthur's grandfather, a Southern planter, left him $1 million in his own right." "I wish I knew how to get some of it from him," murmured Rachel Dane, gazing with covetous eyes after the vanishing sleigh with its fortunate occupants. And no thought crossed her mind that she was the possessor of a secret that the rich Arthur Varian would have sacrificed his whole great fortune to know. Chapter 22. When Years Had Fled. I thought of thee, on ocean many a weary night, when heaved the long and sullen sea, with only waves and stars in sight. We stole along the isles of balm, we furled before the coming gale, we slept amid the breathless calm, we flew before the straining sail. But thou wert lost for years to me, and day and night I thought of thee. One golden July day, almost 3 years later than the events of our last chapter, a little group of 3 persons stood on the deck of a steamer homeward bound, plowing her way through the blue waves toward the harbor of New York. They were Everard Dawn, his daughter, and her friend Madame Ray, the latter having joined them abroad 3 months ago after a long correspondence dating from the time of their meeting in Washington on the occasion of the frustrated elopement. The actress had retired from the stage at last with a fair competency, declaring that she was weary of the exciting life and desired to spend the rest of her days in quiet, away from the glare of the footlights. At Cynthia's wish, she had gone abroad in the spring, traveling with her young friend for several months, while every day of their companionship added to the strength of the bond of affection between their responsive hearts. "I love you more than anyone else in the world," Cinthia had said to her ardently more than once, and the actress had answered as ardently, "And I you, my dear. I wish you were my daughter." The words put a new thought in Cynthia's head. Why couldn't clear, beautiful Madame Ray become her mamma? What was to hinder her father falling in love with the charming woman and making her Mrs. Dawn and thereby her stepmamma? Cinthia felt sure that she could love her as dearly as her own mamma, much more dearly, in fact, than she did her father, for though she saw 100 admirable things about him, and felt rather proud of him than otherwise, Cinthia had never tried to overcome her resentment of the past for those years of neglect and the cruel parting from her lover. She believed that Mr. Dawn and Mrs. Varian had acted a wicked part in preventing her marriage, because of some old family feud that would have been healed by her union with Arthur. So she still preserved toward her father a certain amount of reserve, like a thin crust of ice, and he, on his part, although admiring her grace and beauty, and sedulously careful and attentive to all her whims, still brooded over secret sorrows that made him half oblivious to the present, with the best of his heart buried in the dead past. To Cinthia there came the sudden thought that to make a match between this strange father of hers and lovely Madame Ray might be conducive to the happiness of all 3. Of herself she was sure that life would be far brighter with this fair woman for a companion than spent alone with Everard Dawn, who would always represent to her the blighting of the fairest love-dream maiden ever cherished. She became the most designing little matchmaker in the world, but she was so transparent that she could not hide her plans from the objects of her care. They detected her schemes with secret amusement and pretended unconsciousness, while inwardly rather amused at the little byplay. That each admired the other was natural, But it was not the admiration that deepens into love. Both had been deeply bereaved in a way that left no room for the budding of a second passion. As for Cinthia, those years abroad had been like the bursting of a promising bud into a perfect flower. In a few months she would be 20 years old, and the promise of 17 was more than fulfilled. Her slight figure was somewhat taller and more rounded in its gracious contour, and her lovely face and large, soft, dark eyes had gained a depth of expression, spirit blended with pathos, almost irresistible. The gold of her luxurious curling hair had a deeper, richer sheen as it rippled in a loose knot beneath the brim of her becoming little hat, a Parisian affair that matched her stylish traveling gown, for Cinthia had developed a perfect taste in dress that was very gratifying to her father's pride. Wherever she moved, she was the cynosure of admiring eyes, and a score of hearts had been laid at her feet, some of them most true and manly, but she turned from them with indifference, saying to herself that her life was spoiled by Arthur's falsity, and she could never love again. She called it Arthur's falsity, always refusing to believe that there existed any better reason than a former feud between their parents for the breaking of their troth. She believed that Arthur was a coward, that he had too easily given her up, but for all that she had not ceased to love him, though she did not acknowledge this to her own heart. If you had asked her the question, she would have sworn to you that she hated and despised Arthur Varian, and would not have forgiven him the slight he had put on her if he had implored her on bended knees, so strong is woman's pride. Yet so weak is woman's heart that she shrined his image still in its deepest depths, and could not bid memory down, memory of the brief, blissful time of love, when the world seemed to hold nothing for either save the other, when they had tried to thrust aside, with the passionate obstinacy of youth, every obstacle to their happiness. If Arthur had been as brave as I was, less under the control of his mother, we might have been so happy, she had said regretfully, more than once to Madame Ray, who agreed with her views and always answered, "You are right, dear. He was weak and cowardly, unworthy of such a golden heart as yours. I would forget him." "Oh, I will forget him. I despise him now," Cinthia answered out of her wounded pride. Yet, as the prow of their noble steamer cleaved the blue waves, and she stood on deck under the blue sky and burning sun of July, her thoughts went before to her native land and to her lost lover, so dearly loved, so strangely lost. She wondered where he was now, and if he was married yet, for Aunt Flint, in one of her letters, had not failed to mention that there was such a report in the town. She added that it would not be Mrs. Varian's fault if her son did not find a wife, for she kept Idlewild full of visitors the year round, when she was at home, with pretty girls of all complexions from brunette to blonde. Cynthia's thoughts often wandered to Idlewild, wondering what was transpiring there, and trying to picture to herself the beauty of the gay young girls with whom Mrs. Varian surrounded her son, trying to win his love from Cinthia. It filled the girl's heart with secret, jealous agony that brought shadows of pain into her large, soft eyes as she leaned against the rail and watched the dancing waves. "How grave you look, Miss Dawn, while everyone else is rejoicing at the homecoming. One would think you had left your heart behind you on foreign shores," gaily exclaimed a young man, approaching her and gazing at her with admiring eyes. He was a young New Yorker, one of the jeunesse dorée, returning home after 3 months' absence. On the first day out he had fallen a victim to Cynthia's charms, and gladly renewed a former acquaintance with Madame Ray, in order to secure an introduction to the beauty. As the actress knew him to be in every respect a most desirable parti, she was very glad to present him to Cinthia, secretly hoping that he might manage to supplant Arthur Varian in her tender heart. Cinthia certainly found him interesting. He was so good-looking, with his 6 feet of athletic manhood, flashing dark eyes, and jetty hair and mustache, while with his ready flow of small talk he was very amusing. She accepted his patent admiration and his respectful attentions, with the coolness of a belle accustomed to adulation, letting him entertain her when she chose, and carelessly dismissing him when not in the mood. Her mood was not very propitious now, and it was a very cold smile she gave in answer to his remark that she must have left her heart behind on foreign shores. "All the heart I have I brought back with me, although I must confess to a fondness for the old world," she answered, adding, "I am not enthusiastic over my return, because I have really no near relatives in America, and Papa and I intend to resume our wanderings in our own country after a short rest." Frederick Foster exclaimed eagerly, "May I be permitted to know where the foot of the dove will first rest?" "I think we shall probably spend a few days at Newport while maturing our plans," Cinthia answered carelessly. Foster's handsome countenance beamed with frank delight. He cried joyously, "To Newport! How glad I am! Why, that is where I am going." "Indeed?" smiled Cinthia. "Yes, if you do not forbid my following you there, which I should certainly do, even if I had not already made my plans. Oh, please don't frown upon me so, for indeed I have promised my aunt and cousin, who are there from the south, that I will stay there with them a while. In fact, I shouldn't be surprised if Arthur came to New York just to meet me." Arthur! Arthur! The name struck her sharply like a blow. She shut her lips tightly and turned her head aside, lest he should see the mortal paleness that she felt overspreading it, while she chided herself for her weakness. "Archie Dean, 'tis the sweetest name I know. 'Tis writ on my heart, but o'er it now is drifting the cold, cold snow." Suddenly a great shout arose from the crowd on deck. They were steaming majestically into port, and on the shore they saw eager throngs of friends waiting to welcome their loved ones home. Answering shouts came back from the pier, and handkerchiefs were waved while glad tears started into many eyes. It was such a glorious thing to be safe in port, having weathered all the dangers of the sea. Home again from a foreign shore, and oh, it makes my heart rejoice to meet old friends once more. "Do you see any familiar faces on the pier, Miss Dawn?" queried Frederick Foster, wondering why Cinthia had turned her lovely face away so abruptly. She looked back at him, pale but composed. "No, there is no one that I know," she answered, and in spite of her pride, her lip quivered. It was such a dreary homecoming after all, with no one to welcome her and smile a glad welcome. She felt a keen pang of envy of the happier ones by whom she was surrounded. Madame Ray and Mr. Dawn came up to them, and the actress said with a little smothered sigh, "What a scene of joyous excitement and confusion! Parents waiting to greet sons and daughters, lovers to greet sweethearts. I am almost sad that there is no one to welcome us, Cinthia." "Madam, you are mistaken on your part," laughed Foster. "I see a group of reporters with their eyes fixed on you already, and only waiting till the gangplank is thrown out to rush upon you, demanding to know if it is not likely you will return to the stage again. Tomorrow morning they will report in their papers that you have returned from Europe more beautiful than ever from your long rest, and with a new play that will charm the theater-going public this winter." Madame Ray darted behind him, exclaiming, "Do help me to escape them. I do not wish to be interviewed. I belong to private life now." "Mr. Dawn, will you kindly help the madam to escape the newspaper men, and I will lead Miss Dawn ashore," exclaimed Frederick Foster, coolly drawing Cynthia's arm through his, and rushing forward with the tumultuous throng as the gangplank was thrown out. Oh, what a babel of noise and confusion! But through it all Cinthia could hear the young man whispering ardent words to her, vowing that the past week had been the happiest of his life, that he adored her, and would ask no greater joy than to walk with her through life, arm in arm as now, heedless of the rushing, jostling throng. Would she give him one little word of hope to live on till they met again in Newport? He knew he was presumptuous, but love was his excuse. "Oh, you must not talk to me any more like this. I began Cinthia in confusion, but just at that moment they stepped on terra firma, and came face to face with a young man waiting there with a lady on his arm, at sight of whom Foster whispered to his companion, my aunt and cousin, the Varians. Sky and earth and sea seemed to jumble and blend together in Cynthia's confused consciousness as her startled eyes met the equally surprised ones of Arthur Varian. Chapter 23. I Cannot Love Again. It was the most surprising and unwelcome rencontre in the world, that meeting between those four, Everard Dawn and his daughter, and Mrs. Varian and her son. Frederick Foster was the son of Mrs. Varian's eldest sister, long since dead, and therefore peculiarly dear to her, so that wherever he went, he always kept up a correspondence with Arthur, of whom he was very fond. So it chanced that they had written him while he was abroad of their sojourn at Newport, and begged him to join them there on his return. Later on, the mother and son decided to meet him at the steamer, as he might feel it a lonely homecoming, his father also being dead, and his two married sisters being absent from the city. From the pier they had recognized Frederick on the steamer's deck, but as he stood in front of his three companions, they had not been identified. Otherwise, Arthur would have gone away to avoid a meeting. It seemed to Mrs. Varian as if a most malignant fate had sent them there, when she lifted her eyes and saw before her Frederick, her handsome nephew, arm in arm with Cinthia, while behind them walked Everard Dawn with the beautiful Madame Ray. It was a painful, almost a tragic rencontre, and entirely unavoidable, for Frederick Foster, unconscious of anything wrong, cried out almost boisterously, "How do you do, my dear aunt? Happy to see you, Arthur," embracing them with effusion, and adding to the pale, silent girl who clung to his arm, "Miss Dawn, let me present my aunt, Mrs. Varian, and my cousin, Arthur Varian." A moment of shocked embarrassment was followed by formal greetings as of strangers who had never met before. Mrs. Varian and Cinthia simply bowed to each other, both pale and cold, but Arthur held out his hand, saying, almost inaudibly, "I am glad to meet you." Cinthia bowed without speaking, and gave him her icy fingers in response. Their hands just touched and fell apart, and their faces were as pale as they would ever be in their coffins. Frederick Foster, without observing anything unusual in the air, proceeded to present the others. "Mr. Dawn and Madame Ray, let me present my aunt and cousin, Mrs. Varian and her son." Again there were cold, surprised bows on either side, and the next moment Frederick found that Cynthia's fingers had dropped from his arm, and the heedless, jostling, happy throng had closed in between the two little groups, cutting them off from each other. "Oh, I say!" he cried in dismay. "We have quite lost my friends. Will you excuse me one moment while I follow and bid them good-bye?" But Arthur answered in a troubled voice, "My mother is almost fainting, Fred. Will you help me take her to the carriage?" It was quite true what Arthur said. Mrs. Varian's proud dark head had drooped heavily against his shoulder, and her face was marble pale with half-closed eyes, while her breath came in slow, labored gasps. Somehow, the sight of Everard Dawn with the beautiful actress by his side had given her an almost insupportable shock. Frederick Foster instantly became all anxiety and attention, and with Arthur's assistance he supported her to the waiting carriage. She leaned back among the cushions with shut eyes, while Arthur stroked her brow and hands with tender touches, and her nephew exhausted himself in wondering what had made her ill. Arthur answered evasively, "It must have been the great heat of the sun. She complained of the warmth of the weather while we were watching the steamer come into port." The carriage rolled along toward their hotel, and Mrs. Varian grew gradually better, opening her eyes presently, and faintly apologizing for the fright she had given them. "I am almost well again, and I think we can return to Newport tonight," she said. Foster's thoughts recurred again to his friends, and he exclaimed regretfully, "I am very sorry that I lost sight of my friends, the Dawns and Madame Ray. They, too, are going to Newport, and if I only knew at what hotel they intended to stop, I would go and persuade them to make a party with us going there." "Please do not, Fred. They might think us officious, being strangers," Mrs. Varian cried hastily. Frederick laughed roguishly and answered, "I serve notice on you that you will not be strangers long, for I intend to make Miss Dawn your niece if she will give her consent." "Ah!" cried Arthur, in a strange tone of suppressed emotion. But Frederick did not notice. He was so absorbed in the thought of Cinthia. "Did you notice how radiantly beautiful she was?" he cried. "She is as graceful and stately as a young princess, and her feet and hands are exquisitely small and dainty. Her hair is a shower of gold, and such beautiful, large, soft, dark eyes, so haunting and mesmeric, I never saw in another woman's face. The first moment I met their full glance, I realized that all was over with Frederick Foster." "How long have you known the young lady, Fred?" his aunt asked. "Only from the first day we sailed for New York. But the moment I saw her I was done for, and I believe if I had not secured an introduction to her soon, I should have jumped overboard and drowned myself. Oh, I tell you it was a case of love at first sight, on my side at least. I don't know how it is with her, but I was actually proposing to her as we came down the gangplank and met you, so I did not get her answer. But I shall at Newport, of course. But as I was saying, I got an introduction through the lovely actress Madame Ray, who had been with them several months in Europe. She has retired from the stage now, and I'm rather sorry. I've known her several years, and she was an ornament to the profession, as good a woman as ever stepped." "Perhaps she is going to marry Miss Dawn's father?" ventured his aunt inquiringly. "I don't know. They would make a splendid couple, wouldn't they? And I know that the lovely Cinthia would give anything to bring it about. She is devoted to the charming actress. How I hate that girl!" Mrs. Varian thought, with secret, irrepressible bitterness. "They are all coming to Newport, and I hope you and Arthur will find them as charming as I do. Only Arthur must not fall in love with my princess," continued Foster blithely. Arthur only laughed, and just then the carriage drew up at the entrance to their hotel. As Arthur was helping his mother out, she whispered, "If they come to Newport, we will go away the same day." Meanwhile, the other party, quite as much disconcerted, had sought another hotel. Cinthia lay sobbing on a low couch, and Madame Ray knelt by her side, caressing her and murmuring low words of comfort. "Do not think of him, my darling. He is not worthy of one regret. Only a coward would have deserted you as Arthur Varian did. I am sorry that Fred Foster is his cousin, but that need not matter. He loves you very much, and I would be charmed to see you marry this manly young man." "Oh, I can never love again. My heart was broken by Arthur's falsity," moaned Cinthia, sobbing in unrestrained grief that she would not have shown to anyone on earth but this sympathetic friend she loved so well. "Forget him, dear," the other answered, as she had often done before, laying the golden head caressingly against her breast, and kissing the tears from the sad, dark eyes. When Cinthia had sobbed herself into calmness, she said, "Of course we will not go to Newport now. I must not meet them again." "No, we must not go to Newport now," Madame Ray agreed, adding, "I shall go on from New York to my home in Florida, a pretty estate left to me last year by an old maiden aunt. And, Cinthia, I want you and your father to come with me as my guests." "But perhaps we ought to go and visit Aunt Flint first," suggested Cinthia. "No, for you are in danger of meeting the Varians there." "That is true," sighed Cinthia. "So you will promise to come with me, dear?" "If Papa is willing." When Mr. Don was consulted, he accepted the invitation for Cinthia, saying that he had business that would take him to California for a short while, but he would join them later in the South. Chapter 24. The Pangs That Rend My Heart in Twain. Madame Ray despised Arthur Varian so much that she was bitterly chagrined on learning that he was related to her favorite, Frederick Foster, whom she hoped to see Cinthia marry. Foster had frankly confided his hopes to the actress and elicited her sympathy in his love. She had promised to do all she could to help him win Cinthia, and it annoyed her very much that, for a time at least, the ardent lover would be debarred from seeing the object of his love. Perhaps, too, if he should find out that love episode with his cousin Arthur, he would not wish to marry a girl who had been so cruelly deserted on the eve of marriage. She guessed wrongly that the Varians would very likely use all their influence against Cinthia. But however much she worried, she could see no way out of the dilemma. Foster had been abruptly parted from Cinthia before he had taught her to love him, and she saw no safe way of bringing them back together again in the present. Time alone could solve the problem. It was a great disappointment not to be able to take Cinthia to Newport, where she knew that the girl's grace and beauty would create a sensation. But of course it was not to be thought of now. Cinthia and Arthur Varian must be kept apart for the sake of the young girl's peace of mind. But how handsome and manly he had looked, not at all like the weak coward Madame Ray deemed him. She found herself dwelling with pleasure on his handsome face and form, his dark blue eyes and brown clustering hair, much after the style of Cynthia's handsome father. I fancy he might have looked like that when he was a young man, before the gray came into his brown locks, and the anxious lines into his face, she mused thoughtfully, and her eyes grew grave, and her cheek pale with a sudden, startling thought that made her exclaim, "Good heavens! Could it be?" The line of thought thus started was most distressing, as evinced by the agitation of her face, and presently she muttered, "There may be a mystery after all. I will try to get at the bottom of it." Meanwhile, Cinthia, struggling with the heartache renewed by her encounter with her lost love, or her false love, as she preferred to call him, made a great effort to throw off the weight on her spirits and become herself again. "One struggle more, and I am free from pangs that rend my heart in twain. One last farewell to love and thee, then back to busy life again. It suits me well to mingle now with things that never pleased before. Now every joy is fled below, what future grief can touch me more? By many a shore and many a sea, divided, loving all in vain, the past, the future, fled to thee, to bid us meet, no, ne'er again. 'Tis silent all, but on my ear the well-remembered echoes thrill. I hear a voice I would not hear, a voice that now might well be still." Cinthia could not thrust Arthur's image from her heart, however much she tried and longed to do so. She could wear the mask of pride over her sorrow, that was all. Her father hoped and believed that she was overcoming her trouble, and would have rejoiced as much as Madame Ray if she could have transferred her heart to Frederick Foster. He who had known the pangs of wounded love so well was eager to find a cure for his daughter's heart. But all chance of this had been temporarily frustrated by her unexpected rencontre with Arthur Varian. He felt that all the old ground would have to be gone over now again, and cursed the evil fates that had worked against him. He regretted that a sudden weariness of foreign shores had decided him to return to America, and made up his mind to take Cinthia away again out of reach of the Varians. This was why he had said that he was going to California. He had decided to make a home for himself and daughter under those blue and sunny skies, among orange groves and bowers of bloom, where life would glide so softly amid wooing zephyrs that it would seem like an Arcadia even to disappointed hearts like his own and Cynthia's. There they would win forgetfulness of the past and hope for the future. Chapter 25. Like an Angel. Madame Ray guessed not of the intentions of Everard Dawn, or she would have been most unhappy at the thought of parting from Cinthia. With each day the girl grew dearer to her heart, and it had become her secret fixed intention to make her home near to Cynthia's, wherever it should be, and never lose sight of her again. Her love for the fair young girl was a passion of devotion. She would have sacrificed all she possessed to secure her happiness. Yet Cinthia seemed further away than ever from it now. "Ah, my darling, you should not brood so morbidly over the past," she cried, winding her arms around the fair girl's waist. "You have lost a lover, it is true, but think how much more I have suffered, when scarcely as old as you, losing a beloved husband and a darling infant." "You have lost a child? Dear heart, how I pity you!" Cinthia cried tenderly. "Yes, Cinthia, I have lost a little daughter, who would be as old as you are. It is for her sake I love you so dearly, because you are motherless, and I, alas, childless. It is a sad story, and some day I will tell it to you. Then you will see that my sorrow is greater than yours," sighed the lovely actress. Cinthia pressed her hand and murmured, "You had their love till they died, and in heaven they are waiting to welcome you home, still your own, still fond and true. But he I loved proved false, and another may win him from me. Were it not better if he had really died and belonged to me truly in heaven?" Oh, how sad the pathetic voice, how mournful the far-off gaze, piercing the listener's heart like an arrow. She cried out bitterly, "Ah, Cinthia, you know not the depth of my bereavement. My husband is dead, it is true. I had his love but a little while, but it was bliss while it was mine, and I know it is waiting for me in heaven. But oh, Cinthia, my little one, my baby, oh, oh, oh!" And she dissolved in a passion of tears that startled Cinthia from her own morbid grief and turned her to the task of the consoler. Most gently, most fondly, most lovingly, she caressed the agitated mourner, murmuring to her of the beautiful home not made with hands, where her dead child was a precious angel. "Think what sorrows she may have escaped by her early transition to heaven. Is it not better thus than to have reached girlhood as I did, to have her faith and love trampled in the dust and her life saddened forever?" she cried earnestly. "Ah, my dear, you do not understand. I had not finished telling you. She, my little darling, my unnamed daughter, did not die." "Not die?" Cinthia echoed in bewilderment. "No, she did not die, and I know not to this day whether she is alive or dead. She was stolen from me," sobbed the bereaved mother, letting her head fall on the sill of the open window where they were sitting. Cinthia was so shocked for a moment that she could not speak. She could only throw her arms about the mourner and clasp her close with a love as true and warm as if she had been the dear lost daughter. The balmy summer breeze swept in caressingly over the two fair heads nestled close together, while Madame Ray sobbed, "Now I understand why I love you so, my dear. Not but that your own beauty and sweetness is enough to charm any heart, but when I found you in Washington that first day, a motherless girl scarcely past childhood, forsaken by your lover, wretched, desperate, almost driven to suicide, my heart went out to you in a passion of pitying love, as I thought, my own child, if alive, is no older than this one. Who can tell but that she may be in even more grievous strait than this poor girl, whom I will try to advise and befriend, praying heaven to deal as kindly with my dear lost little one." "Oh, you were an angel to me in that hour," cried Cinthia eagerly, gratefully. "Oh, I was wretched and desperate, as you say, weary of life and longing for death, almost driven by my humiliation to the awful sin of suicide. When I opened that door, intending to rush recklessly into the streets, careless of my fate, what terrible calamity might have happened me if I had not found you standing like an angel on the threshold, sent by God himself to save me from myself. You drew me back, you pitied and advised me, you made me a better girl than I ever was before, and since that hour your love has been to me more than words can express, my anchor of hope in a stormy life, my refuge from despair, my haven of love. Oh, I have been ungrateful, nursing my woe in spite of all your goodness and patience. I will try to be braver and stronger, indeed I will. I will always remember the keen sorrows you have borne while you wore a smile of comfort and cheer for me. And oh, I pray that God has given to your lost child as dear a comforter as I have found in you." The words, poured forth in a passion of grateful emotion, ended in a burst of sobs, and they mingled their tears together and found subtle relief in each other's sympathy. When they grew calmer, Madame Ray said softly in her low, flute-like voice, "I am glad indeed that I have been to you all that you say, Cinthia dear, for you were indeed in need of love and care when we first met. I have lavished on you a mother's love, while you have repaid me with a daughter's, I know." Yes, yes, but I could not fill up the void caused by your own child's loss. You have been a great comfort to me, dear, and I hope never to be parted from you in life unless you marry, and even then, dear, I shall manage to see you often as a mother clings to a married daughter. "How I wish that you and Papa would marry!" cried the eager girl. "My dear, do not nourish such a thought. It can never be. I am sure that both our hearts are buried in our dear ones' graves." "It does not seem as if Papa really loved my mother much, or he would care more for me," Cinthia exclaimed, with the old resentment of her father's strange indifference. "My dear, do not judge him harshly. Mr. Don looks to me like a man capable of strong affections, but he also bears on his face the signs of tragic happenings that have blighted the promise of his life. If you will take my judgment for it, dearest, your father is a most unhappy and weary man," continued Madame Ray. Chapter 26. Neath Southern Skies. A fairyland of flowers and fruit and sunshine, and crystal lakes and overarching forests. "Oh, madam, what a perfect morning! There is not the slightest cloud in the clear blue sky, and the sheen of sunlight on the lake is dazzling. The air is odorous with the scent of flowers, and the little birds are almost splitting their throats with divine melody. What a contrast to the bleakness of November in the north, or even in my own loved Virginia, that 3 years ago I left in the midst of a whirling snowstorm," cried Cinthia Don, as she walked out on the long, broad gallery that surrounded her friend's Floridian home. A fairer scene or a sweeter home would be hard to find than the pretty estate that the actress had opportunely inherited a year before from a deceased great-aunt. It was situated in Marion County, on the suburbs of the pretty village Ware Park, near the Crystal Ware Lake, famed as being the prettiest lake in Florida, several miles in extent, with a magnificent expanse of white sandy beach glittering in the golden sunlight. Lodge Delight was the suggestive name of the white villa, surrounded by beautiful flowers and trees, where Madame Ray had brought her beloved young guest, and for several months they had sojourned here almost happily, but for the haunting memories that made real happiness impossible to either, even in so Eden-like a scene. But at least they were devoted to each other, and led an almost idyllic life in the beautiful, health-giving country so much sought in winter by visitors from the frozen north, while Cynthia's father still lingered in California, though he wrote his daughter that she might expect him now at any time. When Cinthia and Madame Ray came out on the broad, rose-wreathed gallery of Lodge Delight, in their peerless beauty, like the perfect rose and the unfolding bud, they added the only wanting touch to the lovely scene, the touch of human life. The young girl's beautiful dark eyes beamed with fresh delight at the fair prospects spread before them, while she cried out in rapture at the lovely day. Madame Ray smiled with pleasure at the girl's enthusiasm and answered, "It is indeed beautiful, and I am rejoiced that you love my home so well. It makes me grateful to my dead aunt who left me this idyllic estate. It is quite too lovely a day to spend indoors. What shall we do? Go walking, driving, or rowing?" Cinthia, with her golden head one side like a bird, cogitated a moment, then decided on a long drive into the country. The carriage was ordered, and in a short while they were resting luxuriously among the cushions, while an estate worker handled the reins and sent the handsome black ponies spinning at a lively rate along the road, past glistening orange groves laden with the golden globes of fruit, and lovely homes where art and nature combined to make an earthly paradise. "Take us a new route," Madame Ray had said to him, and he had chosen a most attractive one, keeping them keenly interested all the while, until about 3 miles out, Cinthia called to him, saying, "Let the ponies rest a minute, Uncle Rube, while you tell us about those picturesque ruins over there." They had just come opposite the remains of a once palatial mansion that had been destroyed by fire, one of the long stone wings still standing, a melancholy dismantled ruin through which voices of the past might fitly echo with the raving of the night winds. Around it were neglected lawns and gardens, the shrubbery growing in rank luxuriance about the broken fountains, whose tinkling waters had once laughed in the sun. An air of neglect, desertion, and dreariness hung about the place, in spite of all the brightness of the day and scene that sent a chill through the hearts of the gazers. "What a magnificent place this must once have been, and what a pity it has not been rebuilt. Who owns it, Uncle Rube?" inquired Madame Ray, with deep interest, and the old man said, with conscious pride, "It belongs to we, all that's left of old master's family that I used to belong to. This place used to be the country seat of the family, till 3 years agone, when it burned down and the missus moved way off to Virginia and another grand place she had called Idlewiles." Madame Ray and Cinthia both started violently and looked significantly at each other. Then the actress recovered herself and whispered, "A mere coincidence. Dozens of places are called Idlewild." The old man let the reins rest on the horses' glossy backs, flicked a fly from one of their heads with his whip, and continued retrospectively, "This place now they name Love's Retreat, and no wonder, for such a place for courtin' and sparkin' surely never was seen. Old master and missus had 4 children, 2 sons and 2 daughters, all 4 beautiful as could be, and all the young folks in the country used to be comin' and goin' here, and the sparkin' that went on in them flower gardens and rose arbors was a caution, you hear me. But those were gay times before the war. But when that was all over, and Captain Varian comes home with his arm gone, and his 2 sons dead on the field of battle, and all of the slaves free, and everything gone to rack and ruin, why, old missus never hold up her head any more. She just died, they say, of a broken heart for her poor boys lost and gone. And by the oldest girl, she fell in love with a Yank she met up north, and married him spite of all the objections of the old man, who naturally hated the Yanks. Though they say that Fred Foster was a mighty fine gentleman, all the same, and rich as we all folks. But Miss Pliny, the youngest girl, she made a misalliance too, so her pa said, up and married a poor lawyer, and by she got divorced from him, and no wonder. It was a shame the way he carried on with that ward of his, the brazen creature. So now when the captain died 5 years ago, there weren't no one left at Love's Retreat but Mrs. Varian and her little son. They travel about a great deal now, so I'm afraid they'll never build up this old place again." Chapter 27. Where the Clematis Boughs Intwine. Uncle Rube had rambled on heedlessly, as though he loved his subject, while his hearers listened in painful wonder. But now Madame Ray brought him up suddenly by saying, nervously, "That's enough, Uncle Rube. Drive on a few miles further and we will return." A strange terror was stirring in her breast, terror of some startling revelation that might shock Cinthia in the old man's rambling talk. She dared not let him utter another word, but strange suspicions were awakened in her breast, and she resolved to have a private conversation with Uncle Rube to solve her doubts. one of his statements had struck her with peculiar force. He had spoken of Captain Varian's youngest daughter's marriage and divorce from her husband. In the next breath, he had called her Mrs. Varian, Varian being her maiden name. Why did the divorced woman and her son both bear the family name? And who was the divorced husband? Of his name, Madame Ray began to have a secret, prescient dread. Was she about to stumble on the mystery that had sundered Arthur's and Cynthia's lives? She glanced nervously at Cinthia, but beyond a deep pallor saw no sign of shock such as she had secretly experienced. Feeling thankful that it was so, she exclaimed, "Uncle Rube's story has given me the horrors. How sad to think of such a happy family so broken up by the cruel, desolating war. But there were many such. One could almost fancy the ghost of the past haunting that desolate ruin." They looked back with troubled eyes at the wrecked home that had sheltered Arthur Varian's forefathers and his own saddened youth. How strange that he should thus be recalled to memory again, when Cinthia was just getting over their last ill-fated meeting. She read Madame Ray's perturbed thoughts and feigned indifference, saying, "It certainly gives one a sort of ghostly chill to gaze on the ruins of such a home. Do you remember Byron's lines of his old home?" Repeating softly, "Through thy battlements, Newstead, the hollow winds whistle. Thou, the halls of my fathers have gone to decay. In thy once smiling garden the hemlock and thistle have choked up the rose which late bloomed in the way." They rode on along the broad level road, finding always something new to admire. But they did not talk so much or so brightly as before. Their faces were pale and thoughtful, and a shadow had fallen on their spirits, the shadow that always fell when they were reminded of the Varians. Memory was poison to their hearts. "My heart hath but one passion, to forget. Ah, is there nothing in the world, then, to take away the soul's divine regret?" But when they were returning along the same road, both craned their necks eagerly toward the ruined home which had aroused in them so much painful interest. They looked half questioningly toward each other, and Cinthia murmured, I should like to walk among the ruins, should you?" "I am always walking among ruins, the ruins of a life's happiness," the actress answered sadly enough, then added, "But yes, we can easily spare time to go through the place. Uncle Rube, are strangers permitted to enter Love's Retreat?" "Oh, certainly, missus. The big gates ain't never locked. Anybody is free to go in and gather all the flowers they want. It seemed to me like I seen some folks dodging about the trees when we went past, but guess they're all gone now. Shall I drive you in at the carriage road?" "No, you may wait for us here in the shade of the trees while we walk. We will return in 15 minutes. They pushed open the wrought iron front gates that clanged heavily to behind them, and turning from the broad gravelled walk, plunged into the miniature thickets of blossoming shrubbery, shaking out odors of rose and jasmine with the slightest touches as they walked along toward a graceful little summer-house, heavily matted with rich purple clematis bells starring the dark green of the leaves. "Let us go in," said Madame Ray, stepping over the threshold, closely followed by Cinthia. Then both recoiled with a startled cry. 2 young men in cycling suits were in the summer-house. They had slipped in there to hide when they saw a carriage stop at the gate and 2 ladies entering the grounds. "Sightseers whom we do not know, I suppose, so let us hide in here and finish our talk and our cigars till they leave. I care no more for womankind, be she never so fair, since I have lost the lovely queen of my heart," one said to the other, so they fled the scene till it should be safe to venture out. He was dark and striking in appearance, the other was fairer and younger than his companion by several years. His clustering locks were light golden brown, and the beauty of his face was enhanced by the expressive dark blue eyes, where shadows of secret sorrow seemed to lurk in half-discovered ambush. "Fred, they are coming this way by their voices. Let us turn our backs to the door so that they will see we are not anxious to be disturbed," he said presently. "A good idea, Arthur." And suiting the action to the word, they presented their two broad backs toward the newcomers, who had barely stepped across the threshold ere they recoiled, each with a stifled cry of surprise. The Mother Eve that is in all men, just as much as in all women, made the two smokers spring up and look around at the intruders. Then there were more startled exclamations all around. For the fate that seemed to pursue Cinthia Dawn with its cruel irony had followed her even here. She had fled from the far north to the far south to escape Arthur Varian, and she had hoped never to gaze again in life on his too fatally fascinating beauty, the manly beauty that had lured the girlish heart from her breast, only to toss it back at her at the command of cruel parents, who seemed to have forgotten the fervor of youthful love, or they never could have been so harsh to their tortured children. Yet here stood Arthur Varian before her again, Arthur Varian pale to the very lips, Arthur Varian with unmasked despair in his beautiful, dark blue eyes.